Some applications for tape, you won't really be able to use the cart. There just won't be room, or it's a kind of item that doesn't really fit on a cart, such as an arrow or a legend. The first thing we're going to look at here is hand application of blackout tape on either skip lines or cat track or some other kind of broken line. Earlier in the series, you watched how we did a solid line over skip line with the tape cart. And as we mentioned at that point, there may be situations where that is the fastest and safest. But sometimes it might be better to do the covering of a broken line with individual pieces. You use less material, obviously, and in the case of maybe a cat track through an intersection where it may be difficult to run a solid line because of the number of lanes that would have to be closed simultaneously, where you just want to go out on each signal cycle and just grab one or two small pieces, what you want to do is prefabricate the coverings for those lane lines. You saw how I went out and I measured the length of the line we were going to cover, so we know how much tape to cut. We're going to make it a little bit longer than that. I think we measured 7 feet in this example, so we made this piece here 7 foot 3 inches, 7 foot 4 inches. So we're using a 6-inch black tape on a 4-inch line, and we made it a little bit longer than the line we're going to cover. Now we're using some backing from vinyl from the sign shop with the wax paper that doesn't stick very well, but it's just enough to prevent the pre-cut piece from adhering to each other. Now this can be done in the field as you see us doing it here, although ideally you would actually do this back at the shop. If you know the length of the lines that you're going to be covering, you can do this back at the office and bring these with you. For this example, we're just doing it here on site, and that's perfectly acceptable as well. So now that we're making our second one, we're going to again apply that paper backing, and that way when we're done, we can stack these things on top of one another and they won't stick to each other. Out in the field, carry them out to where you're going to apply them, set the rest aside, bring one over, sort of lay it down right where you need it, get it all lined up, peel one end while you're making sure the rest of the tape is held down well, get the end applied, well adhered, flip the entire line over, and lift up the loose end, and carefully making sure it's all aligned, roll it over, bring it down, keeping all the bubbles and wrinkles out of it, making sure it's covering on both sides, and there you go. Use your feet to sort of stomp it down, keep it nice and flat, and there's your skip line. For additional lines, you're going to follow the same process. And keep in mind that once you're done with these, you're going to want to use a tamping cart or a vehicle or some heavy object to roll over these lines and make sure they're really well adhered. Especially if you're doing this through an intersection, a turning cat track is commonly going to be one of your most difficult applications, both in terms of laying it out as well as making a safe space in which to get out there. And you don't want traffic turning on those out in the middle of the intersection and immediately ripping up what you just laid down. Laying down a crosswalk, chevron, or hazard, or other short line is going to be a little different than doing the black skip lines. In this case, we're probably not going to have these pre-cut because we may not know exactly how long they're going to be, or the length of these lines would be a little unwieldy. So generally speaking, what you're going to want to have is some sort of a bar or a rod that you can slide through the center of that tape. You can even use the rolling pin out of the tape cart if you really want to. That's a little heavy, but it will work. You're going to go find your pre-mark. In this case, we had marked out our crosswalk, and as we mentioned, we're going to use that pre-mark line as the front of our crosswalk. So typically this is going to be a two-person job. One person is going to hold the tape. The other person is going to get that starting position marked and held down. Similar to when the tape cart is getting moving, you want to make sure that first piece is nice and aligned. It's a little easier with a very wide 12-inch line as we have here. Sometimes though you might be doing a crosswalk and you don't have a 12-inch single roll of tape. You can certainly do that with 3 rolls of 4-inch. You're just going to have to do this 3 times, or 2 rolls of 6 where you do it twice. In this example, we had the full 12-inch roll. With one person pulling, the other person keeping pressure. Generally speaking, you're not going to do the entire 12 feet at once. You might do a few feet at a time, walk it out, get it stuck down, and when you get to the other side, cut it loose. Not everything we deal with on these jobs is going to be an actual line. Here we have an example where we have an arrow, a type 4 right arrow that we need to apply. And so first we're going to make sure our ground is nice and clear. And then we pull out a prefabricated arrow. Oftentimes on jobs you'll see these done with tape lines that they've sort of hacked an arrow together, and it's not that that can't be done, but the manufacturers actually sell prefabricated tape arrows and legends, and these make our jobs much easier, much faster, and they're much more professional looking. The additional cost of the tape is usually going to be offset by the savings in time from the labor that we're going to deal with out on the job. These arrows come in sections, so you take them out of the box and roll, grab the arrowhead and the arcs and the lines, lay them out. Typically you're going to have this measured with the paint wand, a couple reference points to know exactly where you place this arrow. They come with the instructions to show you the 3 different sections of tape, how they all fit together to make the complete arrow. It's pretty obvious that they only go one way. Once they're all out of the box, you want to get them all laid roughly where they belong. Make sure it's centered in the lane and it's straight, so you know where each piece of that arrow is going to go. Once all of the arrows are properly aligned in their proper place, then you will start with one arrow, and very similar to laying a cat track skip blackout piece, you're going to have someone hold down the arrow to make sure it doesn't reposition, while you then peel up or roll back one corner and peel off the backing and apply to the ground. Sometimes, instead of applying an arrow or a legend, you need to cover them. Here's an example where we have a stop that we need to cover so that motorists cannot read what it says. Now, the MUTCD specifically calls out that when covering a legend on the road, that legend needs to be covered in its entirety so that it is unclear to motorists what it originally said. The MUTCD actually does not allow an arrow or a legend to be covered in the same shape because, as you can see here, it's still very obvious that this is an arrow. So when we cover an arrow or a word, it's important that that is covered as a total square or rectangle so that it is not clear what that legend or word said previously, so motorists cannot be confused. Further, it's important that we actually use striping tape for this job. You can see an example here done by a competitor where they use some blackout paper and some literally black duct tape to make a much cheaper and much faster to apply covering. And while it does prevent motorists from seeing what is displayed underneath, what this doesn't have is any anti-friction ability. If a car hits its brakes on that thing, it's going to rip right through that paper and slide. Or even worse, a bicyclist or motorcyclist going over that in the rain, they're going to slip and they're going to crash, they're going to sue, and they're going to win. That is not designed for a friction surface to be used in the roadway, which is why it is important that when we are using blackout items, we are using full detour grade tape that is designed for this purpose and is not going to become a slip hazard in a wet condition. To create a full square or rectangle, there are multiple ways to do it. You can simply make a series of individual strips that will ultimately make a nice square. This can be a little difficult to get your edges perfectly aligned, which isn't super critical, but if you're wanting to make a little bit cleaner and prettier of a covering, you can make a boundary box first, where you roll out all 4 sides of your rectangle to create a frame, and then you can roll the tape lines in between those boxes to cover the rest of the area to be blacked out. One thing to keep in mind is that the tape is going to stick to the pavement much better than the tape sticks to itself. Now, once the tape has been out in the sun for a while, it's been warmed up, had a chance to sort of get molded in and had some pressure applied, whether it's from a tamp cart or from vehicles passing over it, it will stick to itself pretty well. But at the beginning, it may not be as sticky to itself as you would like. And so when you're applying something like this, you want to make sure that you have typically a little bit of overlap between the strips that are running either parallel or at your edges, so that there's no white paint shining through. However, it may take a little extra work to make sure that your line is started off correctly and doesn't lift up when you try and pull back. You can see in this example that it's possible to do a covering like this with only one person. Now, obviously you're going to need either a lane closure or a road closure or other traffic controllers providing a safe work environment, so when your back's to traffic you're not getting flattened. but the actual application can be done single-handedly. However, having a second person out here would make the job quite a bit faster, as they would be able to hold down that other edge, keep pressure while you're rolling the tape out, and make this a little bit easier of a process. Once the boundary box is created, it's then a relatively simple, if somewhat tedious process to then run parallel strips. It doesn't really matter if you run long ways or short ways, whichever is easiest. The longer direction is probably going to be a little faster because you're having less starts and stops. But whatever is easiest for the job site conditions where you have to back up to, and you keep running strips until the entire legend is completely covered. In this example, just to save tape that is going to get thrown away anyway, we didn't cover the entire legend, but you can clearly see the process and how that would be done to completion. Well, this is obviously more work than a great big flat sheet of black paper and some duct tape rolled around the edges. You can see how it's a much cleaner and better job than those throwaway materials. It's also compliant and safe. Eventually, the customer is going to call you, tell you the job's done, and it's time to come out and return the street to its original condition. That's where tape is such a great tool, is that we don't have to now grind and repaint, restripe, but we can simply go out, pull these lines up off the ground, and the road's back to normal. Some of the tools we talked about earlier, you have a linoleum scraper, which on some situations may work well, but as you can see here, on some tape that's been out there for quite some time and has really been pressed down into the road, that scraper is just not getting the job done. But this smaller hand scraper, we picked this up at Home Depot, it worked great. It allows you to get an edge lifted and started, at which point you can then simply grab it with your hands and start pulling. You can see here that he's having to put quite a bit of effort into pulling this tape up off the ground. That's because this tape has been, as I said, on this roadway for quite some time. It's had a couple years of traffic pressing it down into the asphalt. The sun has been heating it and cooling it, and it's really stuck well. So some of this tape can really take an effort to get up. Now here's an example of that legend that we just did. This tape was only down for a few minutes, never really had any pressure put on it, never had a chance to really get down into the pavement, and it comes up very simply. So the longer the tape has been out there, generally speaking, the harder it's going to be to remove it. You can see here, as he's pulling that tape up, he's folding it over on itself and using the adhesive to stick to itself. This is a really handy thing to do so that when you're done, you don't have a giant pile of very messy tape that is very sticky, and throwing it in the back of a truck or trying to transport it is really bulky, and it's going to stick to everything in its sight. By folding it in on its back, you've created a situation where it's a relatively small and compact, and it's not going to stick to itself. In situations where you're removing long lines, sometimes the easiest solution can be to use the truck. Obviously you have to have room for a truck to drive, but you get the tape started just long enough to get it tied off onto the tow hitch, nice and secure, and then simply drive nice, slow, and smoothly down the road, and the tape will come up. However, you can see here this older tape sort of ripped, and if that's going to be the situation, then sometimes you have no choice but to simply just keep going by hand. It does take some time to get this hooked up to your truck, and if it's going to rip every 10-15 feet, it may not be worthwhile. But for situations where the tape is newer and in better shape, in the past I've been able to pull hundreds of feet in a single pass, although you may have to stop periodically and bunch that tape up. And with that, you are now an expert at all things temporary striping tape. I expect you'll get out there in the street, do a perfect job the first time, and if not, don't worry about it. The stuff pulls right up and you can do it again. Thanks a lot.